All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Ken Lindstrom. My guest today, Allison White. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
This is, in this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. And man, this one, we're going to talk about transgender kids. This is like way behind the Silicon Valley headlines, but I'll let you describe what you do so I don't misrepresent anything.
Sure. So I'm an elementary school principal in Santa Clara County. And so full disclaimer that I'm sharing my specific perspective on this. It's not reflective of necessarily my school district, but it is authentic for my experience.
Yeah. So this came about. Well, you haven't been a principal for a ton of time, right? It's relatively new.
About 4 years, yeah.
I should ask you, we'll talk about transgender, but I was just talking to my sister the other day, the homework. Like every parent I know says there's too much homework. There's more than when they were a kid. Like if all the parents don't want it, like are they blaming all the other parents? Like,
yes, they definitely do that.
What's going on?
There's sort of different camps, and the research is pretty clear that there's two different dilemmas in elementary school. There's nothing that supports homework and having an impact on achievement. Mm-hmm. And parents are, I think, starting to get better informed to say, we believe that the other things going on in our, home at night, being able to be together as a family, soccer practice, all those other things are equally as important, and that kids do their learning during the day, and we need to balance. We need to have some balance. So there's that aspect of it. There's, habits. I think there's teachers that 100% support, appropriate amounts of homework.
Right.
The general guideline, the compromise is about 10 minutes per grade level per night, but that's not ever what ends up happening. And so teachers that do try to cut homework down, they get pushback from just a small group of parents, and unfortunately
they win.
That they can win.
Well, because you don't want to be the other parent. You don't want to be the parent who's like, yeah, no, my kid needs to not study.
And even in high school, so the research that's been done shows that capping out from middle school to high school, there is a benefit. You do see an upward trend in achievement based on homework that's done, but it tends to cap out at about an hour and a half, 90 minutes to 2 hours a night.
That's funny.
I know my kids taking AP classes, there's no way. It's hours and hours of homework. And so we have to look up the line when we see that colleges want kids taking AP courses. AP courses generate an incredible amount of homework per night. And so it just starts,
it's so
pushes
funny.
down.
They figured out the correlation. I remember for MBA school, they figured out that there's no correlation between how you did on the GMAT and how you did in MBA school. There was a correlation, I think, with LSAT. I think if you did well in the LSAT, you tend to do well in law school. But the GMAT, they were like, yeah, it's just simply not correlated. So I was like, is homework really just correlated with smarter kids or not? It's
not. And what's also just as a side note, they are also just starting to look at test optional. Colleges are going test optional for SAT and the ACT. There are more and more colleges for that same reason that are looking and saying what correlates better with kids getting through their 4-year degree is actually their high school GPA and their high school record versus ACT, SAT. And so there are a number of schools, and I think George Washington University is one of the more known ones that are saying it's optional. You can report your test scores or not, and we'll take a look at you either way. Yeah. So it is starting to change. We just need, I think.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, having a real live principal.
Sure. We could talk about that another time.
So transgender kids. Yeah. So I bring this topic up, and people listening, you might be the same as me. Maybe not. Maybe I'm the one. But I was having a conversation with someone around like transgender kids. I've done podcasts with, gay CEOs and, women's issues and stuff like that, thinking I'm pretty liberal hanging out here in San Francisco. I realized on transgender stuff, I'm like, I don't understand this. Like, I'm that guy. Like, I'm the guy. I don't kind of get it. I'm saying like kind of snarky stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like maybe I identify as being something else that I'm not too. Mm-hmm. I was like, wait, all of a sudden there's this thing. It's everywhere. It's on TV. There's now kids in school. And I was like, when it comes to like gay issues, there's always been like, I've always been aware of like gay people. And when we were young and I was in school, we were probably pretty insensitive to it, but it existed. Like that concept didn't come up. All of a sudden, I feel like transgender is a thing. And as I started digging into it as a liberal San Francisco person, much less like, someone elsewhere in the country or who isn't even trying to be educated in this thing, I don't know anything about this.
So it's very interesting. I think unless in our lives we have, it's in our context to know this a little bit more deeply through people we know or friends. I think a lot of us don't have deep knowledge of, the transgender, in general, people that experience that as adults. We see it in, kind of a public context and on the news and Caitlyn Jenner, and we see adults, but we don't often see, a lot of discussion about what happens with kids because obviously people don't just at the age of 20 or 30 or 40 decide that they're transgender. Right. There's something been going on for a long time. And so it's becoming definitely more present in schools. And so, my personal experiences as a school administrator, I've gotten to know about the issue a little bit more because it is relevant to my work. And it's important to me to always be creating, at my school and within the profession, we look out for kids and protect their social, emotional, and physical safety. That's our primary role. And so anything that could compromise that, we want to be on top of and be, kind of at the forefront of creating safe schools. Yeah. So this falls under that umbrella. But in my work, I've gotten to know about this a little bit better. And I share the same thing. I had very little knowledge. And so when it first kind of came to my attention where I felt like I needed to be a little bit more knowledgeable, I was and I think this is typical, is we kind of lump together sexuality and gender. And that's the first thing. I did it
pretty out. I was like, well, of course there's no transgender kid because they're 4. Like, no, it's like, oh yeah, it's not a sexual thing. Like, of course, as soon as you say it and think it through, that's true. But you don't think of like, oh, it's a gay 4-year-old. You're like, I don't know, it's 4. They don't know. They're worried about paste and crayons and things like that. Although some people probably would say you knew then, but it's not a sexual thing, of course. So of course there's kids who are
right. So what families see, and that's the biggest, I think that's the core of the awareness training that schools are starting to undertake for their staff, is that sexuality and expression of sexuality and expression of gender are 2 completely different things. Yeah. And that is probably the most foundational thing to understand about how we can, how it is that we can frame, these discussions about transgender children. And that's it, is that, we all have, there's your sexuality and how you express your sexuality, and that does develop later. But it is completely different. And the core of transgender issues are that for most of us, the way we think about ourselves in our brain lines up with the reproductive organs that we were born with. And so that's all in alignment. I'm female, you're male, and that matches. That matches for me, it matches for you. And in a transgender situation, and has nothing to do with sexuality at this point. Right. And so for transgender folks, and for children in particular, there is a difference between their gender identity, how they think about themselves in their mind, and their physical, the way that they were born. And so those 2 things are important to know about. And then as kids get older and become, somebody who has some autonomy around things they play with, or, and not just talking about gender stereotypes, but, desires that are consistent, then you see gender expression. Right. And so that can be, those are the key terms to think about when we're talking about children and little ones, and how, as they become older, their gender identity starts to become more evident in their gender expression. And when that doesn't match, that's where families start to...
And like, what age is that would happen?
It is when you look at the stories that are easily accessed on, stories and video that are easily accessed and have been in the news. Parents are aware of these things as early as 18 months when kids start expressing that it might be a little different. And one of the things that I've learned as I've kind of done some research on this is, we all talk about, well, sure, we hope kids break out of gender stereotypes in their toys, in their play, in their options on clothing, right? It shouldn't be that girls can wear only pink, and or boys can't wear pink, and boys can't wear something that they want to wear. And so I think the rest of us who don't have children, who are questioning that, I think we just think, oh, they're experimenting. And I think you had said something about just like little kids decide, hey, I want to be an astronaut one day, or hey, I want to be this. So one of the key things for and we're talking about like the American Association of the AMA, American Academy of Pediatricians. So pretty American Psychological Association, talk about it in terms of when kids are very consistent in what they express, very persistent and very insistent. They're very insistent on all the time. No, mommy, I'm a girl, or no, mommy, I'm a boy.
Because that was the next insensitive place that I went, which is, well, you've always had there's always been the concept of a tomboy, right? That's always been a thing. And girls who want to play sports at some point they're just girls who want to play sports. They're not, so it's obviously something beyond that, like that, using the example of a girl, and tomboy was never negative. Going way back, was never really a negative thing. I guess a boy who was acting like a girl was a negative thing growing up to be.
It is much less socially acceptable. And that's, I think this is kind of something that I wanted to bring up. It's interesting that parents are starting to recognize and honor or be aware. It's an awareness that's, I think parents are feeling safer to take note and say, I wonder what this is all about. And I think it's when you see those things where the child is very consistent, persistent, and insistent about that over time, that parents that I've seen interviewed have all said, these are not people that wanted this. Yeah. This is not an easy thing.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that kind of clicked for me is obviously there's LGBT. There's a whole T in there. So it must be it's obviously not an easy thing to do, to have a child who's in this, who's transgender to be transgender. So obviously it's more than I'm a boy, but I prefer, I don't know, dresses or whatever a couple things are. I mean, obviously it's a significant thing. And I guess not having one of those children, it's difficult not to understand what the nuance is. My daughter wants to run around with the boys and play sports. Is that a transgender kid or not? It's obviously not just that.
And what do you do? What's your role? What is the parent's role in next steps? And I think that's what I'm seeing is what I understand is that, until a kid hits school, if they're in preschool and everybody kind of, I think, affords little kids that flexibility socially to know that kids are always experimenting and little ones are, trying on different things, different ways that they like to play. And so, but I think it's when they hit school age, that's where I think most parents start to feel a little more urgency about how to manage that.
So what would the bias, what would you see as another child who's not going to be that sensitive that you would have dissonance with? Would it be, oh, that's a girl dressed up as a boy, or is it that they're in the bathroom? What is the, what would you, how would they get discriminated against?
Right. So I think, there's two different levels. There's at the child level and at the adult level. And I think a lot depends on if children and families have already sort of gotten to a place of feeling comfortable with whatever the gender is that the child's identifying with, and the child starts school fully, transition socially with that identity. So let's say they're, biologically female, but they are, they're identifying male. So they may be dressing male. They may be, appearing male. And I think if you're just starting school and that transition happens before, there's not a big issue because kids are very, kids are kids. They'll play with each other and whatever. I think it's when that transition happens, when kids have known a student or another child as one gender, and then there's a transition that happens, and now instead of that child being one gender, they're identifying and expressing themselves as the other. And it can be confusing, for kids, for the other kids initially, but kids are incredibly flexible and really way less judgmental. I think it's a different story when that happens, when transitions happen in middle school, high school. I think that's where you see the majority of the bullying and the harassment things going on. So my my realm is more at that earlier age. And so I think there's far fewer issues, hopefully, because kids are pretty accepting.
Yeah.
And across the board, I have to say that I think we're hopefully evolving and moving toward just in general, accepting, more accepting place in schools and in the public sphere. But I think that adults have a big issue, that adults are the ones.
That's like, so the first thing I note is that I guess it's more visible than being gay. Like, I guess you don't, like, if you meet somebody, you don't go, oh, that guy's gay. You don't know. I mean, there's some things, but mostly you're just like, I don't know. Like but transgender, I guess you sense it, you see it, you go, oh, that's.
If the transition happened and everybody's knowledgeable about it.
Oh, and you might not know it.
Oh, absolutely. And so that's a really compelling thing to know, what is the preference of the family and the child. And so if the child has transitioned socially and no one's aware of it, then it's a private matter, and it's easy. Not easy. It's just, it's not something that anybody, it's private. It's just private.
It's really the weirdest thing, because you've got, I mean, weird in that sense, but in the sense of like, you're transitioning to a different role. At the same time, the roles are not supposed to matter that much.
Right.
Right. So it seems like just not odd, but it's like, oh, it's weird. Like if everything were the same, would you still be transitioning? But I guess it's the behavioral aspect, not the societal aspect.
Right. Yes. And that's the reason, is that it helps when there's a transition, if the family and the child, have made that decision, whether or not the other settings that they're in, people are aware and honor it.
Yeah.
Or it's just very private, and there's the school setting and then there's everywhere else. And so I think a lot depends on how that transition happens. And we're talking just about a social transition at this point, but and it's a transition, and then it's kind of done, in the sense that, if the end of 1 year of school, you are identifying or socially appearing, female, and then by, when you start the next year, you present your identity, your gender expression is aligned with your gender identity, which is male, then, or vice versa, whatever I said, then people will get over it.
Yeah.
They need to adjust. And that's where, kind of my role and teachers' roles comes into play, is to be very, clear about any student's right to be, for that not to be then cause for mistreatment of any sort at school.
And what is the bias against it? Like,
it's a discomfort. I think it's just strictly my sense is, for kids, I don't know that for younger kids, I don't think there's a big issue.
Yeah.
I think kids do definitely like to sort things out into broad categories. And so why initially a kid might be confused, they'll get over it.
Yeah.
Little other kids will get over it. But I think adults, it's a little harder for adults to kind of, if it's, clearly not their child, their own personal opinion about it. And what maybe that idea of discomfort with what it means for a child to be questioning their gender identity it's not something many of us have had a lot of experience with. And
I wonder if that's not interesting, but like, if you're people who are anti-gay were probably raised that way, and they've always just, whatever, it ain't right, whatever brings you to that state of mind. You've probably
from a religious background or whatever.
You've been raised that way. You don't decide when you're 30. Oh, I decided I don't like that. With transgender, you probably haven't been raised that way because you never thought about it. So you've got to kind of learn about it and then form a negative opinion about it based on whatever Bible or whatever you look at. Yeah, I don't know.
Or just buy in, I think, on the
it ain't right, or it doesn't look right.
Or just the skepticism. And I think, yes, kids are going to sort of take on, I think, opinions of parents. And, I think depending on what part of the country you're in, or, knowledge base around things, again, it's a fairly private thing, because once a child has made a transition, or even if another important term is gender expansive. And so there are students, I will say I had experience with a really interesting experience in the past, where we had a student that appeared to be questioning their gender, but wasn't settled on one thing, didn't make a big,
Right.
hadn't come to any big decisions.
Yeah.
It was just a kind of more typical what you expect as kids kind of feel out what fits them, what's right for them, in terms of their gender identity. And, I could look at this student and think, I wonder if that's where this particular student was going or not. And I got a call at the beginning of the year this year, and the student had changed schools. And without going into detail, because of a transition in middle school, the locker room PE thing came up, and it blew up.
Yeah.
And what was so amazing was the school's counselor had the wherewithal to call. And so the day this student appeared to be in crisis, and it was a crisis in that moment, because the student absolutely could not deal with going into the locker room assigned to her, the gender that she had, is on her birth certificate. And I don't think the kid had realized that it was coming to this point themselves. And so what was really nice, and I think it's kind of like what you've said at the beginning of this conversation, this counselor had not had a lot of direct experience with this, but people, I think, maybe I'm naive, I do think people want to do the right thing and just support kids. Yeah. And so she called, we had a really long conversation. We talked through, some things like we're talking about today. And I'm confident that student is not going to have an easy path, because this potential transition might be happening in middle school. And that's where I think kids you get into more kid bias middle school, high school. But here's another thing though, that I have to say that contrasts with that, because I think sometimes in our adult world, our context for all of these things in high school is, 15 to 30 years ago, right? Depending on your age. And so we know how kids that were different were treated regardless of what it was.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And, there wasn't I think out there, the importance of, legally a school's duty to protect kids from discrimination and harassment. And so very interesting last weekend, so our daughter was on homecoming court for, her high school in the South Bay. And one of the students who was on court, so was sort of nominated by staff and students, is gender expansive, meaning not necessarily even choosing one or the other, is still exploring what that gender identity is like. And so instead of electing a king and queen, this high school had homecoming royalty, and so there was the court, and then two students were elected to be homecoming royalty. So the gender terms of king and queen, I think, are going to be falling away. And one of the students was male, and the other student was the transgender student.
So what did they call him?
Royalty, homecoming royalty. And so this student, I believe, it kind of appears to identify more male in dress. And so they honored that so there were two of the bigger...
Oh, so they weren't just transgender. They weren't identifying as a male. In which case they might say, I'm king.
Well, so I think they honored the students. I'm not quite sure what went on behind the scenes, but they honored the students' preference for the more traditionally male crown versus the princessy, rhinestone crown, which I thought, the student was elected by, her peers. And this is not the first time that's happened at that high school. Yeah. That high school a few years back elected a lesbian, definitely not transgender, but a lesbian student was elected homecoming queen. And so I think high school kids, and maybe we're just really fortunate at this particular school that I think kids are much more inclined to be accepting of some of these differences than we all were back in the day. Yeah. So this Gunn High School is also, I think their homecoming may have been this past weekend. There was something in the news. They have decided to do away with kings and queens altogether. It's just court is elected, is nominated, and all of those students are honored for their, leadership and contributions to the school culture.
I would guess what the bias is. Well, and also people are now, a lot of, who's the guy? Savage, the gay, he's really...
Oh, right. I don't listen to him, but...
Outspoken. So I grew up, my dad was in the closet forever until his 50s or so. And then when he came out, it was very traumatic for him, but not for me and my sister, because we were in college in the 80s. We're like, oh, okay, cool. Like that's what everyone does. But I think the big thing that happened is like once everyone just met gay people was a lot of it. Like realized who was gay. Like, oh, that guy. I like that guy. And so I'm sure now there's a lot of that too, where if it's known that you're, like I said, you might not be known, but once you know it, you're like, well, I don't know, he's a fine guy or he's an asshole or whatever. He's like everyone else. I think that's what happened with the gay. A lot of it was like people's sons came home from college and they had a boyfriend. Mom liked the boyfriend, and
it's about people. It's about people. It's not about that label. And that's why I think it is with transgender kids is that if the adults can all stand down and maybe be conscious of their own discomfort and not project that onto kids and let things unfold and set an example about acceptance and asking questions and being respectful. I think that once as you say, once the transition happens and the knowledge is there, if the child chooses for it, and I think younger kids, depending on the circumstances, I think younger kids, it becomes less of a big deal. I think the family's choice about how public or private, the information is, that there's just different contingencies, and families, I think, really have to come to, their comfort level with how broad they want that knowledge shared. So it's not, the bias I would guess, and I'm saying, I'll just be honest, these are the things that I was kind of thinking. One is, it sounds like a phase. It sounds like the kid in a school, a bunch of kids, you want to get attention. You're like, oh, I'm transgender. And there's only one of me and 10 of me out of 1,000. So it sounds like a phase, but as you learn about it sounds like it's not. Like kids don't go back and forth. Or is that another thing? It can be. And I think so what's out there right now in terms of the law and the way that we, as kind of a protected class, that gender, what we are learning so much more about sort of gender identity and learning the vocabulary and the idea that a student has a right to say, I'm neither one or the other. And I know biologically we can, and I think skeptical adults might say, bullshit, you're this or you're that. And that's sometimes what I hear people say is kind of like, come on, look, this is how you're built. This is who you are. And I think,
it sounds, I literally mean sounds. I don't actually mean this. It does sound kind of, it's pretty easy to make fun of it once you get past queer, lesbian, gay, trans, queer, questioning, pan. You're like, okay, that's getting to be a lot. Like, is everyone just declaring that they're, something? It's susceptible to being something you could make fun of.
I think because it's not visible. It's something that is a disconnect between someone's core identity, which is in their head, and that's not something that anybody can, there's not a blood test, there's not a set thing, and so that's where and so this is interesting too. In my role as a school administrator, as a principal, everybody is allowed to have their personal opinions, right, about the whether they're skeptical, whether they're whatever, and the thing that is important to me in the realm of school when kids are at school is, and with staff, is no one's asking you to change in your personal, your deep personal thinking, what things you might believe, because until you start having experiences, I think that's it is, right? It's easy to make fun of something or to be skeptical from afar. And I think the more that people are able to, the more parents are able to feel like it is safe to, work with schools or to encourage their child depending on what they're seeing. And like I said, the stories that I think we're going to put links on this page, the interviews with families that have, and families talk about, seeing this start to come up when kids are just, getting language and starting to exert preferences for things. And, when you see somebody who's 18 months or 2 years old and it's consistent and insistent, for years, it's really hard, I think, once you're in the midst of that to say this is just a phase or that it's just something that the kid's just kind of fooling around or whatever. And I think, and the other thing that comes out of a lot of these interviews is just this deep despair that even little kids feel when they're forced to, it's okay at home and you can dress how you like in the house. And this literally, some of these things that we'll link to are interviews and stories that are done. And these kids are then forced to put on a false identity. And so to imagine feeling like out in the world, you have to walk around faking something, all during your day when you're out at school or you're out at preschool or whatever. And that it's not safe to be who you are.
Yeah.
That's a terrible thing. And for kids, you talked about bias and sort of the harassment at school. We know that children who, where it's sort of not honored and respected, and because we can't say, here's the test for this, whether it's true or not, or whether it's real or not.
Do you consult with a if you've decided, hey, I think our kid's like, this is a boy, not a girl.
Right.
Do you go talk to a pediatrician and they say, look, if these 8 things have happened for this many days, or I don't know, however they do it, is there something where they say, yeah?
So my understanding is that, yes, parents absolutely tend to consult, their pediatrician to start talking about it. And like I said, the, American Academy of Pediatrics has policy statements on this. It's not considered something that's, kind of vague or wishy-washy. There's pretty good ways to, and because nothing's done at this point, right? Because that's the next thing is as adults, we start thinking, well, there's physical things that start to happen for adults that want to transition, right? That's a pretty hard transition because you have to do a lot of things.
Which is also, I guess, pretty obvious, but wasn't to me. You don't have to, you can just be transgender and not do any other physical transition. Well,
so here's something I've learned in my, just kind of the research and trying to be more knowledgeable about this is, and in fact, just a couple days ago, something popped up from a TED Talk back in 2013, because I wasn't familiar with how sort of like, okay, I know how the ideal way that we should be dealing this within schools when kids are, between the ages of 5 and let's take through elementary school, 5 up to the age of maybe 11 or 12. And it turns out that, and this is obviously a decision between families and their doctor, but depending on the path that the child's been on, if it becomes something that the family really, believes and the child's very insistent, one of the biggest things that makes it hard for adults who haven't transitioned, medically is, we haven't talked a lot about how do parents then help children transition physically, right? Medically.
Oh man, that's some advanced parenting. That's a tough one.
And this is where, again, parents consult their pediatricians. Pediatricians refer to endocrinologists. And I learned something within the past 2 days. You're not going to do anything permanent, but what they can start doing so that it eases a kid's transition later is around the age of 12 or before puberty kicks in, is there are medications that endocrinologists can give kids that are put puberty on pause. Doesn't do anything permanent, but it pauses. Wow. And the reason they pause it is that if, as the kid hits the age of 16 or so, and they decide as a family that this is the decision that the child really is insistent, consistent, and persistent about, that becomes the next stage at which then they can start doing things that become more permanent. And then at age 18.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. But here's the thing. If you picture somebody being able to enter adulthood and that, hormones haven't been able to turn on that would make, fully manifest you as a male or female, you've been able to stop that process and furthermore get your physical body more aligned with your gender identity. The dilemma for parents is just incredible, but you can see how as adults that children who have been, honored that way, who have been heard and are able to get their gender identity matching, more their physical identity, their path, their mental health outcomes are so much better because right now they know that, the statistics I think are something like 40% of transgender high school students have thought of suicide.
Really?
Oh yeah. It is not a good outcome.
Wow. It's advanced being a kid too.
Right.
Not just tough parenting.
On top. So incredibly difficult and challenging, mental health outcomes. And so if earlier transitions, the idea is that by honoring and really watching and listening to kids and parents, this is a kid and family, issue. The idea is that you would have, much more sort of healthier outcomes for kids
right.
as adults, because they're not undergoing sort of,
Right.
you know, more traumatic transitions down the road to try to take away, you know, hormones that have already been in their bodies for years.
And at that age, there's probably not a community. Like, just making stuff up. And I'm guessing if you're gay, the community is that you're attracted, since it's happening at a later, you know, it's a sexual thing. The community is that
that's an adult.
You find the
right.
other people who are like you,
Yes.
and whether you're hiding it or not, there's at least two of you. Where a transgender kid's probably like, oh, yeah, I'm just alone in the world.
And it's private, and it is by its nature lonely, because, you know, it's not something that you easily run around saying, you know, if you've identified as something that's different than your biological, you know, biology, then it's personal and it's private, and you're not going to easily stumble upon.
Yeah.
Because you're not wearing a sign.
How do the parents take it? Obviously, the full spectrum, but it seems now that, at least here in Silicon Valley, the parents I know who have gay kids are like, cool,
absolutely,
fine, you know, whatever. I mean, at least outwardly, they don't seem that upset about it. Has that helped, like, the transgender kids?
I think transgender, my sense, and I just want to make sure people know I am not, I am somebody who's learning, and just because of the role I have in schools, I really want to be ready to support, should that come up, for families and kids that I interact with. And so I think, I think it's hard, and I think parents must question a lot when their kids are really little. And I think it's just that ongoing questioning, and then hopefully working with, pediatricians. And I think there's support groups out there for parents of kids who are questioning. There's great organizations, particularly in the Bay Area, where I think parents who are trying to figure that out for themselves, is my child just, is this a phase, or is it something that, how can I help my child ultimately reach adulthood as a happy, well-adjusted person? I think that there are plenty of options in the Bay Area, certainly to find like-minded people to say, how will I know? Yeah. How will I know what to do?
It seems so emergent. Like, I don't know, 5 years ago, I couldn't have told you transvestite from transgender. And suddenly, so the T is there, and LGBT, like, it's on TV. You talk about it. I'm still just intrigued that, like, it's not something that I've known for 30 years. It's something that suddenly is just...
Well, I think there's such safety. I mean, there are such safety risks. And as we were getting ready for this, I didn't have time to go back. But I mean, if I think back over the past 15, 20 years about things that had been in the news, terrible, terrible things about transgender, teenagers and young adults who are trying to live their lives, and who are, brutally beaten, who end up in, if not killed, in very, very risky and unsafe situations because it's found out that they are transgender. And I think that as people have risked more and become more public, and, we're fortunate we live where we live, I think that people are taking more risks around having conversations about it. And I think there's much more meat to the law around what schools are compelled to address when it comes to just in 2014, January 1st, 2014, a new law kicked in, because AB 1266 that really specified, because there had been previous laws about discrimination, harassment, and what schools are compelled to do to protect, in general, to protect your typical protected classes, race, that kind of thing, that you're not allowing discrimination on your campus.
And this is a state or federal?
That's a state law.
Okay.
States are allowed to make those laws themselves. But then just in January of 2014, another law kicked in that was specifically about that specified transgender issues, and so related to being able to use bathroom facilities that match with their identity, and that's protected, and that schools need to honor that and make that happen. Being able to play on a sports, if it's a gender separated sports team, playing on the team that matches their gender identity, that schools don't have the right to say, sorry, your biology outweighs what you feel as a person. And so, I
would think that would be the easy thing for them to do. Like, I would guess that that's probably why they have if you're a school administrator, I'm sure you're in the middle of one group that thinks it's inappropriate and one group that's like, but that's what my kid is. And you're like, I'm just going to go with the biology. Might have been a way out before the new law.
Well, and I think knowing that, what might the other people in the general public in that school community push back on, if that's what, if we chose to let that be part of the conversation, I think you can acknowledge in a school community, that it might, there was something I just was reading today about, it's not against the law for somebody to be uncomfortable. Right. So it's okay that other people may feel uncomfortable with a transgender student, using the bathroom or playing on the sports team, but it's not okay for it to be unsafe for those students to do that. So meaning that, just because other people feel uncomfortable with the notion doesn't mean that we cave on that.
Well, and that's the whole history of racial inequality and how that got dealt with. Like there's a lot of people, it's
a
still to this day, it's against their beliefs even, not just uncomfortable. And, so,
and that's why
doesn't matter.
This is discussed now, I think, as a civil rights issue. It really is. And it's one of those kind of things I just think, because there have been such trauma and such safety issues for kids as they've become young adults. I think the fact, what's fascinating to me is the way that this has kind of played out in the past, look at the past 2 years in the adult world, right? And in, the public sphere around, again, like Caitlyn Jenner. And then I think the show is called Transparent. Jeffrey Tambor, right? Won an Emmy, I think, for his portrayal. And I think,
that's a fantastic show, by the way.
Exactly. And his acceptance speech was so moving. And it's just like everything else. I think when we start surfacing this and stop, it's not a taboo topic to discuss, I think it's going to be, I hope in 10 years, maybe it's not 10 years, hopefully it's sooner than that this just becomes an issue that is, it's personal. And to the extent that a family or a student cares to discuss it or not discuss it, we honor that, and they are allowed to fully access their right to free and appropriate public education, just like any other kid.
I wonder who fought for those laws. Like if it was the parents of kids who would not themselves then be necessarily transgender, statistically probably not, or if it was actually the transgender community. Well,
no, I don't think anybody went out of their way ahead of time. But what's unfortunately, there were a lot of lawsuits. School districts were getting sued because they were not maybe making a good common sense call, and maybe being a little too susceptible to feeling backlash from their communities, perhaps. And so they made decisions that were, when questioned by families and students, were found to be, supporting discriminatory practices. And so, the more recent law, there was, like I said, there was a law in 2000, and that law, let's see, that's one that was AB 537, was passed in 2000, and that started getting at sort of kids have a right to be at school, kind of anti-bullying, right? Kids have a right to be at school and not be harassed, and be safe. And specific classes weren't specified. It was kind of what you would find under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And so states have begun passing, state level law. There's no federal law yet. But there are only, believe this kind of was awful to think about. There are only 9 states in the country that have passed specific laws about the rights of transgender students in schools. And it's kind of shocking. It is and it isn't. I guess we could say it's
I can imagine a lot of states where that's not...
They're not there yet.
Yeah, where you're not the state senator who's going to fight that battle, probably.
Right.
I mean, I could see it.
Yeah. So I think it's going to continue to grow as an issue to talk about. But I mean, bottom line is that schools, we know, our goal is that kids are at school and learning and being able to launch into adulthood and complete their education. And so the other thing is when harassment and discrimination occurs, rates of truancy or just not showing up at school. You can well imagine if you're a transgender child or a child, who's gay, who is being hassled, you're going to stop showing up at school. And so now you've lost your right to get your free and appropriate public education. And so these laws have an impact across the board. So it's good that they're there. But as I was saying before, I think, we come at it from both. There's a moral imperative, right, to do what's right for kids. Well, we can't count on that because people come from lots of different backgrounds about how they feel personally. So in my realm and the way I've, talked to my staff about it is that we are ethical imperative. We have ethical imperatives in our profession around keeping kids safe. And that means not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, socially safe. And then there's, and now further we have legal imperatives, which we start from that point of view, which is, hey, your personal opinion about any of this is no one's trying to change anybody's mind about how you feel when you go home at night. But when we're at school, we want to be crystal clear that our role is to support the safety of all students, no matter what.
Yeah.
And it kind of simplifies things. And I think that's where we need to go with, families, if there are issues with families and, kind of if there's community pushback, which, I think in certain situations may come up for some schools, but I think it's got to be, hey, all kids.
Yeah.
All kids all the time.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't heard the stories, but I guess there are people who are not happy about people being transgender which I've never, having grown up in California, I never feel like people actually choose that battle or care, but apparently they do. I
think when it comes up, or they, you might hear of a circumstance that's closer to your community, and I think people tend to think, really, there's that skepticism.
That is that was my bias. Was kind of like a girl who wants to play sports, like that's a tomboy, and we had that forever, and you can call it whatever the hell you want. But
come on, really, it sounds like parents sort of indulging kids and or making more of something than it is.
But then when you realize how difficult, obviously,
why would anyone choose that path?
Yeah.
That path of challenge and just real difficulty for their kids. And, I think so we had started to say that, in the adult world, there had been, I think, a growing awareness, right? And especially with the Caitlyn Jenner transition, very public transition, earlier this year. And so kind of around that time, I think what's blown this open a little bit more, like I said, Rolling Stone put out this article back, in 2013 about a very young child. And it was for me, that was the beginning for me of an awareness, just like what you've talked about, which is I didn't know. And I read this article and it was just kind of blew my mind because I had no point of reference for it. And it helped me right from the get-go of reading this to think, how could anybody think anything else when you hear the kind of agony that these parents are going through about this difficult, and not that it shouldn't end up being a negative situation. It should just be helping a child, ultimately kind of discover who they are and help them align who they are. And so that was the only foundation I had for much of anything. And then I think, as you just continue, again, the adult world, some of the transitions that have been happening, but what happened this past spring was, and some people may have caught this in the news, but, Congressman Mike Honda. Oh yeah,
so I don't know this story completely. So starting with who Michael.
So Mike Honda is a long-term congressman for a district in the South Bay, and he's been in Congress a really long time, and he had been asked in February to go speak at a school superintendent's conference, and my understanding is he wasn't able to make it, and so he sent them a statement instead. And Mike Honda is he's head of the Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus, so he's been in that role for a long time. He also co-founded the Congressional LGBT Equality Caucus with Barney Frank. Yep. And there's another congressman that was part of that too. I apologize, I don't know her name, but that was back in 2008. So he's had a demonstrated commitment to this for a long time, and so he sent a statement followed by a Twitter. He tweeted out a really nice tweet with his granddaughter. Who is transgender. Yeah, wow. And it really hit the news. Yeah. It was a very, very public figure, being very forthcoming about his very personal experience with having a transgender granddaughter. And so that was in February. And then by April, another thing that was big in the news this year was NBC Nightly News did a series I think it was about mid-April. We'll put the link up for that too. Yep. They did a series and profiled two children who had been, whose parents had been through this, were going through this experience. And so that was, I think, I have to say in my experience, that was the first time this issue related to children had been so publicly. Yep.
Well, I think that's probably something that's happening too, is that when, Jeffrey Tambor, the actor on transgender, winning the Emmy, and then I don't even follow that whole thing, but I
Right.
know everyone else does. It doesn't occur to you, those are like adults. So you're kind of like, oh, if an NFL player came out as being gay, like that whole narrative, it doesn't even come into your thinking, oh, wait, no, 4-year-old kids and 5-year-old kids. So even that didn't open up anything in my mind about kids. So it was like, I very much equated to like the kind of thing that we all saw in the gay community, which was, young men kind of organizing their power and changing something. So yeah, so that just wasn't obvious to me from that opening up of things until I started having conversations with people.
And I think the most powerful thing of all for people that might still feel somewhat skeptical of, the legitimacy of this as an authentic, medical issue,
Right.
Is to watch these interviews. And I mean, these are to this NBC Nightly News, listening to Mike Honda speak about his personal experiences. When you listen to parents detail out their experiences and realize they are not looking to have their kids be poster children for anything.
Yeah,
they
right.
we all as parents want our kids to be safe and happy and healthy.
Yeah.
That's what any parent wants for their child. And so to tune into this and then to decide I'm going to have to help, advocate for my child based on what I'm, seeing from them. It's such a, I think, pretty gut wrenching for parents at the beginning as they start to explore this. And I think when you listen to these interviews, there's nothing stronger, I think, to help someone understand what the glimmers of what it might be like. But I also think how authentic it truly is.
Yeah.
To actually listen to interviews with parents. And there's on the web just countless now ways that you can. There was just something somebody messaged to me the other day about. I think on Cosmopolitan Magazine's website, there's a really lovely interview with a family. So, Rolling Stone, Cosmopolitan,
Right.
This is becoming something that I think the media really does, is creating a platform where this information, so we're not just looking at it from afar.
Yeah.
If we don't know somebody that has a transgender child, we can, through the virtual world, we can sort of hear someone's story, see their faces, see the child and think, oh, wow, my mind is blown, but okay.
Yeah. Well, and sure enough, the media probably came from one of those reporters having a kid. Like,
Absolutely. I think it's been underground.
Yeah.
And that's why kids end up with trauma, when they're transitioning more openly as adolescents, that I'm guessing the signs were there all the way along, and it just was too difficult for parents to not support it, but just, it's risky. It's been risky for kids. Yeah.
Well, I thought it'd just be nice to take a gentle walk down the path and like nothing medical, nothing like I'm not going to join the community or anything, but just like, oh yeah, I've been thinking about this, like not very hard. And the second I spent a couple seconds on, I'm like, I don't think I'm lined up right on all this or have even the sketches of a story. And I think we have a little bit of sketches of how this works now.
Good.
Have we covered this?
I think so.
I think it's pretty good.
All right.
Hey, thanks so much for doing this.
This was really neat. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk.
All right. My guest, Allison White. This is Kent Lindstrom. This has been the Something About Your podcast. Thanks so much.